All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I am excited to be here and I hope that you are. Welcome to today's webinar. Welcome to the Youth at Work webinar series. This is the sixth out of all the webinars we've been doing, and it has been a super insightful and packed 6 weeks. This webinar series have been to promote evidence-based policy making, expert knowledge sharing, and good practices on youth employment in Africa. Today, we're going to be talking about youth at work and the future of work. My name is Chiamaka, and I'll be moderating today's session. We started this webinar series a few weeks ago, focusing on discussions around the green economy. And then in the next week, we took it a little bit further to discuss the rural economy in week 2. In week 3, we had a conversation discussing the effects of conflict and crisis on youth at work, as well as the opportunities for development. And then this necessitated a discussion on policies and government actions in week 4 to improving youth employment indices and by extension development. And then we had a conversation on how these policies could be cohesively structured into an enabling environment and what that would look like. And that we did in week 5. Today, we wrap up this conversation with the future of work, and I'm honored to have been the moderator and carried everyone along in these impactful discussions since the very beginning. I'm looking forward very excitedly to today's session, today's conversation, and I'm excited to learn and to discuss. Each of the webinars is structured in this way. There's a presentation of an evidence synthesis paper, and then conversations reflecting on the evidence synthesis paper. We will have a lot of very interesting and insightful speakers today. So I trust that we're going to have a lot of questions and a very packed discussion. So first of all, we'll start with a few ground rules. The webinar is being recorded and parts of the recording will be used on Include social media and website. If you would like to speak, please raise your hand and you'll be unmuted. Please leave your questions and comments in the chat and we will collect them and address them in the time allocated to clarification questions and discussion. Now I'm excited to introduce our speakers. We're going to be having basically two sections. So we'll have the first group of speakers and then we'll have a short time to have a few discussions and questions, and then we'll have the second group of speakers. So starting off our conversation today, we're going to be having a presentation by Louise Fox and Landry Signé, and they'll be presenting the research paper and analytical framework to the future of work, and Landry will be discussing considerations on aspects of governance on the future of work. Louise Fox is Chief Economics at USAID. She's also a visiting professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and a consultant in developing economics, specializing in employment, labor markets, gender, social service delivery, and poverty reduction. And Landry is managing director and professor at the Thunderbird School of Management, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and a distinguished fellow of the Stanford University. And then after that, we'll have presentation by Niall O'Higgins and then Hannah Dawson. Niall is Niall is a senior research specialist in ILO's Employment Analysis Unit and professor of economics at the University of Salerno. And Dr. Hannah Dawson is a senior researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at the University of the Witwatersrand. So as you can see, we have a lot to talk about today, and I'm looking forward to the conversations. I will now hand over the floor to Louise, who will be starting the conversation with the presentation of the research paper. Louise, you have the floor now.
Thank you very much, moderator. Yeah, I just want to say it's an honor for Landry and I to be here and to share our research with you today. And we're grateful to the Dutch government and the Include platform for supporting this research. One quick note of clarification: I'm no longer chief economist at USAID. I gave up that assignment a few years ago. Let's get started. the main question we addressed in our paper is, first of all, what is the fourth industrial revolution? And the second question is, what will it mean for economic transformation in Africa? And what's maybe more unique about our paper, there's been a lot of papers written about the fourth industrial revolution. Technology is coming, it's going to change the world. Our focus is on Africa, on employment, and in particular on the segmented labor market, the fact that there's a large, more than half of the labor force works informally. And the question is, what will the fourth industrial revolution mean for both that segmentation and that section of the labor force that works informally? Okay, so starting out, the fourth industrial revolution. Okay, so if you've heard about it, you probably heard about it, about robots and AI, but it's really a collection of interdependent technologies. And it builds on, of course, the third industrial revolution, which was digitization and the internet. And it's basically a set of technologies that work together often, or may not work together, but mostly work together, that come from biology, computer science and engineering, a number of different disciplines. And the real point is, all these new technologies are coming on stream fast and are being used already in the developed world. And they're changing already production and consumption. The Internet of Things, some of us have linked houses, some of us talk to Alexa, that's all part of the fourth industrial revolution. Now, our argument is that Africa will want to adopt these technologies, and in some cases will have to, in order to be competitive in the global economy. And the real question is, in Africa, will it help Africa transform? What do we mean by transformation? New firm entry, firm growth, which would create more formal wage jobs and raise labor productivity and earnings. And if it does, what about the remaining jobs in the informal sector? Will they benefit as well? Okay, so just to get everybody on the same page, this is a simple graph from a paper I did last spring. We'll put the link up to that paper at the end of this presentation, that shows the share of the population that is in wage employment. And we all know wage employment, this is not formal, this could be informal, but informal wage employment is often a step to formal wage employment. And formal wage employment is really what helps to create decent work. And what we see is that until you're an upper middle income country like South Africa, most of the employment is in the informal sector. It's not wage employment. It's people working for themselves or their families, either on the farm or off the farm, in marketplaces and in production areas. Okay, so what we also see is that in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as in the rest of the world, wage employment does grow with income, because economic transformation is what creates a higher income country, usually. You can be Saudi Arabian and not have much transformation, but otherwise, it's what creates wealth and raises income. And what we see is in sub-Saharan Africa, we've had some transformation. We've had a growth of wage employment prior to COVID. And especially if we look at the lower middle income countries, things were proceeding well on transformation. Sub-Saharan Africa was in the same place as the rest of the world in terms of transformation. In other words, if we benchmark it, it was right where we would expect given its income. Then COVID came, and that, of course, slowed down this pace of transformation, halted it in many countries. But the point is that things were moving. Now, the question is, we address in our paper, is we kind of have to look through the crystal ball. So when people say, well, what's the potential? Can it create good jobs? Well, we have to make some forecasts and some projections. So how do we do that? So we didn't follow this bean counting approach that many others have followed, that says, so many jobs will be lost, so many new jobs will be created, et cetera. And there are two reasons for that. First of all, every industrial revolution, going back to the steam engine and electricity, and the gas-powered engine and all of that, and digital revolution created and destroyed jobs. But it was very hard to predict in advance. And also there's a timing issue. And the outcomes, the extent to whether the outcomes are really good for workers really depends on public policy. It's not technology. Technology is a tool, but the outcome in terms of economic transformation and employment transformation and better jobs and decent work is really a public policy issue. So how did we handle, what's our methodology? Well, we started with the production side, the firm really, and the farm, of course. Where do we see potential for an expansion of wage employment? And where do we see potential for increased earnings? And is there potential for increased earnings in the informal sector? Most people don't really address that when they look at this technology. What are the downside risks and what policies are needed to support inclusive transformation? And in terms of the policies and the downside risk, that is what my colleague Landry will address shortly. And the real point is Africa has a young workforce, so will youth benefit. So our predictions are, with the right policy investments, this technology can improve job opportunities. It's a skill bias technology. It's a technology that requires higher skills to employ. That means that youth could benefit the most. So then we did a sectoral analysis, starting with services, which is the sector that employs the majority of Africans. These sectors could really gain formal jobs in tourism, in e-commerce and logistics, and also business process outsourcing from richer countries to Africa could increase the share of formal employment. In the other sectors, we don't see the share of formal employment rising if and when this technology is adopted. In agriculture, the technology could potentially bring an income effect, higher productivity, higher yields on the farm, higher labor productivity by creating higher value crops and marketing those crops more effectively. And manufacturing, we don't expect manufacturing to gain much employment because this technology is also capital biased, but it could hold its share of employment because in some cases, the technology will allow Africa's manufacturing sector to expand. But we suggest that for the foreseeable future, informal will remain normal and the factors driving informality are already in place. So those are our predictions in a nutshell. I'm turning now over to Landry to discuss some of the challenges and policy issues.
Thank you very much, Louise. And I would like to start by expressing my gratitude, our gratitude, and I think as highlighted by Louise at the beginning for participating both in this seminar series, but also providing us with the opportunity to draft this paper. So I'm honored and grateful to be here with you. And in terms of challenges to the fourth industrial revolution and technology adoption, so many factors, we want to discuss many factors. So all the potential which has been shared here by Louise earlier, so realizing that economic growth, employment opportunities of the 4IR in Africa will really depend on government action extensively. And we have numerous factors there. Louise, can you move to the next slide, please?
Absolutely.
Thank you. So we have numerous factors to be taken into consideration. The first one, governance. The inadequate regulatory framework and business environment is one of the biggest challenges faced by African government. And this is really despite the variations across countries among other. And the business environment will particularly hinder firm entrance and growth, which is a prerequisite for increasing the amount of share of formal wage employment. So this factor is a critical one, which really need to be improved. And I'll be happy to further discuss some of the solutions later. The second challenge, an extremely important one also, so the gaps in physical and digital infrastructure. And those are reducing the prospect for increased access to technology. As pointed out before, the fourth industrial revolution is really characterized by the fusion between the physical, the digital, and the biological world. So we have the frontier between those, which is blurred, and it's also characterized by the velocity, so the incredible speed which we see innovations, by the scope all the sectors are affected in a way or in another, and by the system impact. So in order to unlock productive innovations and technologies associated with the fourth industrial revolution, building critical physical and digital infrastructure, whether electricity, internet backbones, fixed broadband, mobile telecommunications, communication satellites, network infrastructure, data center, cloud computing, among other, will really be extremely important. So this brings me to the third challenge, the limited knowledge or skills and information. And it is clear that from preschool through university, many students in numerous African countries are not acquiring the skills which are really needed for the fourth industrial revolution job market. And that lack of skill has really created an obstacle for the fourth industrial revolution technology in Africa. And those skills, including digital engineering, so rarely need to be unlocked with specific governmental initiative. So those are some of the key challenges that we face with governance, with infrastructure, among other, and agility. To what extent government could be nimble, flexible, fast at identifying some of those challenges, unlocking the potential for innovation on one hand, but on the other hand, ensuring that those innovations will serve the greater good while being properly regulated. And those challenges are not just Africa-related challenges. I think many other countries are also facing similar challenges. So next slide, please. So now speaking about solutions, what could be done? So I think the most important action to be taken by government is related to what is missing. A broader, comprehensive, effective, and implementable strategy that will address various challenges faced by government. As a matter of fact, instead of focusing on a single ministry or a specific sector, government should really develop agile and accelerated multi-stakeholder collaboration, engaging various public agencies, but also the private sector, civil society, external partners in the policy-making process to bridge the gap between the intention when designing policies and the implementation outcomes. And those comprehensive policies obviously should include areas related to education, employment, youth, technology, finance, infrastructure, cyber security, among other. An extremely important factor is also the role played by the donor community, which should help African governments as they formulate and implement strategy, whether through technical assistance, through providing resources where needed, providing grants amount order. We have seen multilateral actions. For example, the African Union has developed a digital transformation strategy for 2020 to 2030, aiming at really encompassing plans for job creation and digital inclusion through skills development programs, capacity building, amount order. So this type of initiative should be supported and are already supported by some institutions, including the World Bank or the African Development Bank, which have provided some resources for those strategies. The private sector should also play a key role, whether we speak about acting through investment or corporate philanthropy. And this role really includes public-private partnerships, which we have seen growing in the continent. We think about Facebook and the Rockefeller Foundation, Microsoft amount order, which are playing a key role. So I think to sum it up, it is really important to think holistically, because the fourth industrial revolution, tech innovation, job creation, those are areas which are where interconnectedness is important, where complexity is important. And that is why we are proposing to adopt a comprehensive, effective, multi-sector, multi-actor centered strategy, but while also addressing the very specific challenges that we have discussed earlier. For example, by revising the regulatory frameworks, improving the business environment, and creating inclusive policies, also increasing access to technology, closing the gap in physical and digital infrastructure, especially in sectors with the high quality employment potential for young people, and finally, really closing the skills gap and increasing human capital. So we'll be happy to further discuss those questions with you during the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Landry. Thank you so much, Louise. It's been a very interesting presentation, and I think that there's going to be a very robust discussion from this presentation. I'd now like to move on to Niall O'Higgins, who will be giving a presentation on transformations of the job market and the quality of new jobs. Niall, you have the floor now.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, let me just share my screen. Hi, I'm Niall O'Higgins, and yeah, I'm going to offer some, I hope, complimentary remarks and reflections on the excellent presentation and paper that we've already seen regarding youth and the future of work, and in particular the fourth industrial revolution. In particular, I'll offer first some context on African youth and on the pandemic, and then I'll talk a little bit about the fourth industrial revolution, and in particular digital economy with relevance to African youth, and I'll end up with some concluding remarks on policy. So some context. Well, I think we all know that the youth labour force in Africa is rapidly growing. In fact, it's the only region in which the youth labour force is growing significantly, and it's in stark contrast, shown by the blue line in the figure, stark contrast with, for example, what's going on in Asia and the Pacific. And significant here is, of course, that it's expected to continue growing into the foreseeable future, and this is, of course, is both an opportunity but also a challenge. And if we look at what's going on with young people and their working poverty, Africa, the blue line again, is the region where youth working poverty is falling slowest. Again, in stark contrast with what's been going on in Asia and the Pacific. And this has in part to do with the nature of employment and youth employment. Depends on the definition of informal employment, how actually big it is, but certainly in Africa, the informal sector informal employment in general is much larger than it is anywhere else in any other region, and it's particularly high amongst young people. And this is I would say, as indeed Louise pointed out, this is the major challenge. So the problems of the labour market in Africa in general, of course, there's much variety across countries, but in general, it's much more about jobs and job quality than actually the number of jobs and youth unemployment as it is elsewhere. Added to that, we now have COVID. So COVID, yes, hits youth employment hard, especially young women and especially in lower income countries. What we show here is the reduction in youth employment, youth and adult employment between 2019 and 2020. And one can see that the losses in employment were much larger amongst young people, and particularly young women, and were significantly larger in middle-income countries. Now we have emerging data also from low-income countries, which tends to support the idea that the losses have been even greater in low-income countries. So it's a very challenging situation. I wanted to, in this context, I wanted to offer a few reflections on Fourth Industrial Revolution first and African youth. So work we did a while ago in our last Global Employment Trends for Youth shows that actually the risks of automation associated with technological change tend to be relatively concentrated amongst young people's work. This is to say that the change in youth labour markets is faster than it is elsewhere. Against that, one can say that, and this is particularly true for less educated and vocationally educated young people in particular, and much less so amongst the tertiary educated. In general, one can say that the threats or the risks of automation are much lower in Africa. Tertiary education seems to be some sort of protection, and indeed was mentioned already, the idea of high-skilled employment was already mentioned. If you look at what's been happening, though, in a range of countries between the first decade and the second decade of the new millennium, one can see that in many countries, the supply of highly educated workers, that is the tertiary graduates, has outstripped the growth in the number of high-skilled jobs. So the point is that tertiary education is not a panacea, will not resolve everything by itself. And certainly the more general problem is the lack of skilled or indeed more generally productive jobs available in the continent. So what about digital and internet-based work? Well, crowd work we've looked at in some detail, in particular young people versus adults. And although this tends to be a fairly precarious form of employment, young people are particularly suited to these kinds of digital jobs. And they certainly have some relative advantages from doing so. Young crowd workers, although earnings in crowd work, at least compared to high-income country earnings, are relatively low, young crowd workers actually earn higher wage rates than older crowd workers. And this is due entirely to a faster returns on experience, or in other words, young people learn faster how to do these tasks, and so their wage rates increase faster. And that's shown on the right-hand side of the figure, with in blue the young people are red, adults, and the figure shows the percentage increase in hourly wages accruing to job experience. So young workers in general do relatively well compared to older adults. Of course, it's particularly attractive to young people in lower income countries because the prevailing local wage rates are much lower, and that's particularly the case in Africa. The third observation I wanted to make here is also that a curious finding is that the returns to formal education in this type of work are practically zero, although most crowd workers are relatively well educated. So they typically have at least secondary education. So the digital economy offers some opportunities. Internet-based jobs can be attractive, especially for youth and especially in Africa. In particular, regarding the wages, are really rather high compared to local alternatives. But this requires access to the internet, essentially. It requires infrastructure. So we did some micro simulations suggesting that there would be sufficient, significant, albeit fairly modest gains in employment arising from the expansion of mobile broadband infrastructure in Africa, a substantial share of which would go to young people. So that's on the positive side. But of course, this does require, as already mentioned, a substantial investment in infrastructure. Also, more broadly, it's not just about access. There are also issues of the access to electricity and more basic issues. And in itself, digital economy jobs are not going to be sufficient. So I think a more general job opportunity strategies need more job creation policies as an integral part of structural transformation. One thing to note here is that the digital economy is likely to benefit, as already suggested, the more highly educated, and therefore there's a danger of further exacerbating inequalities in the region. So just to finish off with some concluding remarks, I mean, clearly there's a need, and I think in complete agreement with what we already saw, there's a need for long-term comprehensive and coherent strategies for structural transformation, and needed to indeed to create sufficient better quality job opportunities, and that's the key. From an ILO perspective, we see that within an integrated employment policy framework, encompassing macroeconomic, labour market and sectoral policies to create job-friendly framework, let's say, which should also include investment in digital infrastructure, such as, for example, expanding mobile broadband networks. There is significant job creation potential, but it also requires other complementary investments. And indeed, it was already mentioned, international financial institutions perhaps and international donors can perhaps support this. What I would emphasize, however, is that education and entertainment in the continent is still rather low by international standards. Much progress has been made. Access to primary education has increased rapidly and the illiteracy rates have fallen, but there much more needs to be done. And this, I think, cannot be leapfrogged because it underlies the basic nature of trying to encourage inclusive employment growth and inclusive youth employment growth. On top of that, of course, there is a role for a more, let's say, oriented role towards STEM and digital skills and such like. This is also a fundamental part of the process. But I would just emphasize that, as I mentioned, tertiary education and higher education in general is not necessarily a panacea, and attention needs to be placed also on educational mismatch and oversupply that I pointed to earlier on in the presentation, and also the issue of the dangers involved in widening gaps in opportunities of young people. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Niall, and thank you for keeping to time. I would now like to hand over the microphone to Hannah Dawson, who will be talking about the growth of the digital economy in South Africa and implications for youth employment. Hannah, you have the floor now.
Hi everyone, and just to say, as has been said by others, it's a real privilege to be with you, and thanks to Maya for doing a lot of the organizing and for the invitation. So, I mean, as has been said in many of the presentations that have gone before, the changing world of work and its implications for youth and youth unemployment is, of course, a key challenge of our time. But much of the policy debate around 4IR and the future of work has often tended to ignore the kind of lived realities of the way in which work in the present is experienced in the context of wide levels of underemployment, poverty, and inequality. And at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, where I'm based, the Future of Workers Research Project, with support from the IDRC, has been grappling with how digital technologies are reshaping the world of work and its impact on inequality in the global South. And my presentation is kind of split in two parts. The one is to give you a sense of some of the broad emerging research findings from the project, and then to give you a few insights specifically from the South African context with a focus on youth and young people. So the Future of Workers project focuses on the Global South, partly because that's, as has been said, where there's a significant kind of knowledge gap, but also because we see it as an area, as a location in which we're going to see the greatest contradiction. And by that, I mean, in many senses, a kind of unevenness in the adoption of technologies, but also their impact on different sectors and different contexts, etc. And so as a project, we really see digital technology as neither inevitable or necessarily progressive. Rather, it's a kind of contested process, which really highlights the need for ongoing empirical research. And the project is currently in its second phase, and we're doing sectorally based studies in 3 sectors, primarily financial services, agriculture, and platform work, in 8 countries, 4 of which are in Africa. These include Ghana, Kenya, Mozambique, and South Africa. And in particular, we're interested in 4 key themes. The one relates to the impact of digitalization on companies' business models. The second relates to the impact on the changing labor process and the conditions of work, which is in part around what jobs are being eliminated or created, but also the impact on the conditions of work. Thirdly, is around worker struggle and organization, and thinking about how workers themselves are responding to digitalization. And fourthly, questions around labor and social policy, which I think has come out quite clearly in the first two presentations around the regulatory role of the state as it relates not just to labor policy, but to bigger macroeconomic industrial policy questions. And a cross-cutting area across all of our work is, of course, a variety of inequalities, from race, class, gender, to nationality. And thinking about some of the emerging findings that have come primarily out of the first phase, because we're in the midst of finalizing the sectoral studies, there's a number of key findings. The first one is just the extreme diversity within the Global South. And I think the same could be said for Africa in certain senses. And that's important because these historically specific conditions shape how digital technologies are adopted or not. And again, is an important part of understanding the unevenness that I was referring to before. The second relates to the fact that digitalization requires investment and firm decisions, so the role of capital or big business, to adopt new technologies, and that the decision to do that or not reflects broader considerations related to the cost of labor and profitability. And we have some really nice findings on really the differences in the South African context between the automotive industry due to its links to and its need to be globally competitive, which is quite different to some of the patterns you're seeing in the service sector. Coming to the service sector particularly, many of the digitalized jobs here are characterized by high levels of precarity. So my colleagues at the Southern Center, Eddie Webster and Fikile Masakane, they've been doing work with location-based platform workers across 3 African cities. And in a piece that they call the Uberization of work, they really show that most workers are misclassified as independent contractors by platforms, in many ways to bypass existing labor regulations and protections. And like many other informal economy workers, platform workers tend to work long hours for low wages, although the previous paper was very interested in thinking about differences even within platform work, location versus crowd-based, and in relation to the other types of opportunities in the labor market. Fourthly, is that despite the precarity of working conditions in the platform economy, new forms of organizing are emerging. And this is a significant component of our work is looking, for example, at the emergence of self-organized and hybrid forms of associations that are emerging in the platform economy, and how these are similar and different in different African contexts, and what they mean for alliances being built between traditional trade unions and new forms of organizing for shaping the debates around the terms of digitalization as they relate to the conditions of work. And then fifth is that the research stemming from the Future of Workers project also points to the interdependence between digital and non-digital forms of work. And I'm going to come back to that in the second part of my presentation. So now coming to think about questions of youth unemployment and the digital economy. And in the context of wide-scale youth unemployment in South Africa, the digital economy is increasingly gaining a lot of attention and is increasingly viewed as kind of having latent potential to bring more young people into work or into the economy. And this includes the growth of entry-level jobs in digitalized services, forms of platform work, both location-based and crowd work, and digitalized forms of micro-entrepreneurship. The possibilities, however, as we've heard, all hinge on broadening access to the internet. And South Africa has one of the highest mobile data costs in the world, which of course exacerbates a variety of structural inequalities, but in particular perpetuates the digital divide, which hinges on other inequalities. And this has significant implications for young people to participate in the digital economy, never mind other areas of life. So despite increasing awareness of South Africa's high data costs and the growing public outcry, which includes a vocal campaign that goes by the hashtag data must fall, as well as a commission of inquiry by the Competition Commission into these high mobile data prices, change has been slow and piecemeal, with both policymakers and regulatory authorities not taking, at least in my opinion, decisive enough action. And yet, despite these challenges and inequalities, the government's program to tackle youth unemployment is very much harnessing the possibilities of digital technology. And I think the clearest example of this is, some of you might be aware of it already, is the South African Youth Mobi portal, which is part of the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention, that is set up to help young people access information about entrepreneurship and work opportunities, but also to prepare them for the world of work. And this is a zero-rated site that young people can access for free, of course, on the basis that they have a cell phone. But while initiatives like this are important and address important information asymmetries, they do not create jobs, which of course is the key challenge. But nonetheless, I think they show how digital technology can leverage a series of initiatives and do that at scale and at relatively low cost. So the critical question then is, what is the role of digital tech in creating jobs for young people? And Harambee Youth Employment, who operate the Youth Mobi site, have long argued that digitalized services, which incorporates what Louise was referring to in terms of business process outsourcing, is really having the potential to unlock entry-level jobs for young people at scale. And in the South African context at present, twice as many young people, or South Africans in general actually, are employed in digitized services as they are in the automotive industry. But despite South Africa in many senses having a competitive advantage in this space, many jobs are currently being lost to this work being outsourced to China, India, and Eastern Europe. So I think the opportunity, at least in the minds of Harambee and other policymakers, lies in the fact that these types of jobs don't necessarily require a tertiary or university degree. But I think some of the challenges related to them highlight the links between the digital and non-digital forms of work, but also thinking about these questions in relation to a global economy. And then just two other last quick points. The first relates to that it's often said that digital transformation is opening up many more opportunities for small and medium-sized companies to kind of compete in ways that weren't available to them before. And I just wanted to, I'm happy to discuss this more in the questions, just to point you to the fact that the Competition Commission in South Africa is currently undertaking its first market inquiry into the digital economy, focusing specifically on the e-commerce and online intermediation platforms, because there's a concern in the ways in which e-commerce has exploded in relation to COVID, that there's already one or two companies with such dominance that this is potentially squeezing out smaller, in particular Black-owned companies from really being able to compete. And lastly, digital platforms are often said here and across the continent to ease entry into labor markets. And I think that's true in many senses. But a lot of the more detailed research which has been done on the experience of platform workers shows that these jobs do not necessarily mean a real change in terms of insecurity and in the unpredictability of earnings. And so I think this really highlights, as has been said throughout the pandemic, the importance of rethinking social protection schemes to include informal but also new forms of gig work. And I would say the jury is still very much out on whether platform work or the digital economy more widely will, on the one hand, entrench or even justify the casualization and informalization of work, or if it will actually be the catalyst some see it to be for strengthening employment relations and processes of formalization. And I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you to all our speakers who have led this first batch of discussions. So I'd like to say again that if you have any questions for our speakers, you can please just put them in the chat, but I do have a few questions that I'd like to start with. And then before we take any other questions that the audience might have. So I would like to start with a question for Landry or Louise. And then this question basically is going to be talking about, it's asking, considering the recent steps towards an integrated continental market with the AfCFTA, do you think there should be more advocacy for nation-based strategies and infrastructure for tech and digital jobs, or should we be looking at something that is more continent-wide or region-based?
I think Landry should answer that question. He's the AfCFTA expert on our team.
Okay.
So no, thank you. That's an extremely important question, and I think it is not either or.
Mm-hmm.
We need actions at different levels.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a continental strategy which is not implemented nationally, that means that you have nothing. Mm-hmm. And if you have national strategy without harmonization at the sub-regional or continental level, the broader functioning could be suboptimal. So it is extremely important to have strategies which are well-grounded. And as a matter of fact, in my forthcoming book, which will be released in the middle of next year, Africa's Fourth Industrial Revolution, I propose those set of strategy both at the continental, sub-regional, and national levels. So definitively in the context of the African continental free trade area, having both strategy will be important, and this is valid not just for the fourth industrial revolution, digital transformation, but also trade. For countries to trade with one another, they need infrastructure to move from, let's say, Cameroon to Nigeria. So, and if the action is adopted at the local level, that will facilitate also the continental coordination. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. And the point that you just made is super important, because there has been a lot of conversation about integrating trade and using technology to interconnect, especially young people. I can mostly talk from that aspect. Integrate trade and exchange of services, goods, ideas between young people, as well as payment platforms that are easy to utilize across the continent. And this is something that has been in the conversation, and I think is a very important area to explore, especially when talking about young people, employment, and integrating young people in the future of work as regards the digital economy.
So I would say just one thing, which is that certainly the third industrial revolution, the internet, has allowed a lot of sharing between youth of different countries and sharing of ideas. And since youth are usually the first to adopt new technology, adapt new technology, and use it productively, that's great. But what's really important and what we stress in our paper is that it's firms that create jobs. And so the real question for governments is how to encourage more labor-intensive production. And will the fourth industrial revolution help with that? And we argue that is a matter of policy. If you subsidize capital, as we do in the US, you will get more automation. If you don't, you may get less automation. So it certainly is a matter of policy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Louise. And then, you know, that leads into my second question for you, because this is an interesting point that you raised. And I think we had a similar conversation, I think in the last two webinars. I don't know if Maya remembers, but there was a conversation as regards technology being utilized by young people versus big companies, small SMEs versus large corporations, and that there has been, you know, a whole debate around that. And, you know, the conclusion of your paper and the point of your talk has been on emphasizing on policy, especially as regards large firms and corporations. But I'm just going to ask, so in your opinion, or from the research that you have done, some might argue that there has been an explosion of jobs. I mean, during the pandemic, there's been an explosion of jobs using digital technology by young people who were not necessarily working within the purview of government policies or actions. So do you think these type of jobs are sustainable and will lead to sustained development, the kind of development that we want to see in African countries? So I want to know what your thoughts on that argument would be.
So I'll start, but I want Landry to come in on the pandemic and the explosion of jobs using digital technology. So in every economy, jobs are created and jobs are destroyed. And jobs for life is not going to be the way of the future. That's really come out, and it's really never been the way of the future for Africa, except for people who are, for example, farmers and maybe farmers their whole life. They may change how they farm and gain. So I think the question about jobs being sustainable maybe is not particularly the best question. The question is about winners and losers. And so the focus of our paper is really that we need to make sure that since the informal will be normal, they can also be winners. But Landry, why don't you address COVID and new forms, new opportunities that have been revealed themselves in Africa?
So definitively, COVID-19 has accelerated some trends which were already existing pre-COVID-19. So I think that is one of the critical points to highlight. And if we, let's say, without generalizing, we can clearly see that with the evolution of the third industrial revolution, including with the internet, because a lot of people, there's this debate between what is the third industrial revolution versus what is the fourth industrial revolution. So the fourth industrial revolution built on the third industrial revolution, which was the digital one, but goes much further because, as I pointed out earlier, we have that frontiers between the physical, the digital, and the biological world, which those frontiers are blurred on one hand, and on the other hand, perhaps a good illustration of it, even if it is not yet generalized on the continent, it will be the metaverse. So now that people are speaking extensively about the metaverse, I think it is a good illustration of what the fourth industrial revolution may be. And now, whether you speak about entertainment, you have the growth of more initiative in entertainment related to internet, the growth of e-commerce with various platforms which are created, evolving among others. So I think that we will see those trends continue. And this is not only related to COVID-19, but that is also because the digital world is gaining a significant importance, which is to a certain extent similar to the actual physical world. We have a frontier which is blurred, and that will go increasing. So it's not anymore about whether those jobs will be sustained or no, but the extent to which they can provide better wages and sustain employability for young people.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Landry. Thank you so much, Louise. This is an ongoing conversation. And one more question before we go to the last batch of presentations. This question is for Hannah. I think we can address this to Hannah. And it's from Marlene, and she makes an important point that all of this is still new and it is still evolving. So there is going to be a lot to be learned in the process. So it will be important to also look at how to evolve. So she's asking that she'll be interested to know if there are any examples of projects, approaches that have taken the danger of increasing the digital divide at heart and successfully design approaches to reduce inequalities. And if so, what has been the experience? So I think this question is from Marlene. She's asking if there are any examples of projects, approaches that have taken the danger of increasing digital divide at heart and successfully design approaches to reduce inequalities. Hannah, would you like to answer the question?
Sure. Thanks, Marlene, for the question. I mean, I think, well, you're right, exactly, to be saying, in a way, so much of what we're all trying to describe and understand and speculate in a certain sense is so difficult because it's on the one hand new and it's changing so fast. But to your particular question around the digital divide, I don't have a perfect example that shows what could be done, at least not one that comes to mind immediately. If anything, I think COVID has highlighted how deep those digital divides in the South African context are, in particular in the education sphere. And so, the other inequalities, be they socioeconomic or gender related, have only been exacerbated in contexts where internet is not available. It's available at a huge cost relative to other household expenditure, compared to someone that lives in a house where there's fast fiber in a city. So I think the structural issues that perpetuate the digital divide, from the high cost of internet to the ways in which it intersects with other structural inequalities in the South African context, but which are similar, I think, in many other parts of the continent. Those require structural change. But I mean, in one sense, the recommendation of the Competition Commission was that the four big telecommunications companies dropped their pricing by, I think it was 30 or 40%. Now, in following that debate, it hasn't been done. What they've rather tried to do is create particular packages where you can get 1 gig. So there have been some small wins. And some of the other compromises that have been met is that, for example, MTN has agreed to make, I think it's 200 websites, they zero rate them. So there's now a range of educational health websites which you can access anywhere without actually needing to be online. And I think those are very important. And the Youth Mobi site, that's been key to how it's developed. But there are also now education platforms which are based on that premise. So I think that is a small example of something which is possible that grapples with the digital divide, but it doesn't deal with the underlying issues.
Thank you so much, Hannah. And I see someone has put in the chat that they have a report that talks about the digital and gender divide, and thank you for sharing that. This is a very important conversation, and like has been said, it's still evolving, so there's a lot to talk about. So we're going to still have a short time of discussing this a little bit further, but we're going to take the two more last presentations, and then we can wrap up with that. So I would like to introduce our last two speakers for today. We have Mirjam Horstmeier and Kehinde Ayanleye. Mirjam, Kehinde is the co-founder of Stutern, an organization connecting African millennials with technology skills and job placements. And Mirjam is working at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the role of Senior Advisor on Professional Education, especially the link between education and work. And Mirjam will be starting first with presentations on the Dutch Ministry's role and strategies and policies related to the future of work. And then Kehinde will be presenting on the work of Stutern in Nigeria with reflection on the quality of jobs created within tech. So I'll now like to hand over the floor to Mirjam to have the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me and having me over. And thank you for all the presentations, which were very rich and interesting to listen to. Happy to hear also your views on what the government should do, like building or developing a strategy that is integrated, holistic, implementable, which is very important, I think. I was very happy with the interventions of Hannah that highlighted also the diversity in a continent, on a continent as Africa, but also within countries, between women, men, between people living in rural areas, in cities, all kinds of difference from that has to do with socio-economic backgrounds. I think that's very important also for the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I like the last question of Marleen, who is like, yeah, are there any good examples? Because I think forecasting how things will change is very difficult. As the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we really always like to pay attention to the connection between education institutions and the private sector, because we believe that private sectors are on top of what's happening in the labor market, or what's happening in the market, which can have an influence on the labor market and also on skills development. So I think working with private sector is very important in this case. I think also what is also important is to have this kind of studies going on, looking what is working, having pilots in the market on what is working, what is not working, and learn from it very fast. I also liked Landry saying that a strategy should be agile. I think agility is very important in this kind of in these contexts of changing in the fourth industrial revolution, because the technology is going so fast and the changes are very fast. So for us, the Dutch ministry, we are having huge interventions on improving educational institutes, making them future-proof. If you understand what I mean with that, like training young people in 21st century skills, having them adaptive skills, so that also that they are entrepreneurial. So entrepreneurial skills are not only to build up your own enterprise, but also to be very problem solving, agile in what you can do, what you're gonna decide, what you're gonna do. For us, we are also hammering on the digital divide. The gender gap is enormous, and not only the gender gap, the gap between rural and urban is huge. I think what also mentioned earlier is the connectivity. I think we are, as a Dutch ministry, also very much in favor of having all areas connected to the internet, and having all people connected to the internet. And that again, it comes into be aware of the gaps that there are between the difference that there are between different groups in a country, or even the differences between countries. Another thing that is also very important for us is the safety of the users of the internet, and also the decency of the jobs that are created in this new context of the fourth industrial revolution. And lastly, I think it's also mentioned already is the infrastructure and the road, the transport. I think that is very important, and we're working on that as well. The Dutch ministry, as you might know, does have several projects that are working on this, or programs in Africa and the Middle East mostly. Very important within these projects is that we also work with young people, that we don't only have them working as participants of a project, but also taking them into account from the start, from the development of a program till the end. I think that's something that we shouldn't forget as well. That we intervene with the end users, or what we're working for. Private sector development, the private sector, the connection with the private sector is very important. Something that I forgot? I don't think so. No, that's it. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And you made a very important point, which I know I repeat at every webinar. And this conversation is focusing on young people and young people in employment. And it's impossible to have a full conversation on young people in employment without involving young people, not just as end users, you put that perfectly, not just as end users, but as collaborators, originators, and co-creators of the plan from the very beginning. I say this at every webinar to remind, just to, reiterate that point, that it's very important that program and planning takes into consideration the fact that young people need to contribute from the very beginning. So thank you so much for mentioning that. And then I'll move on now to our next speaker, Kehinde, who is the co-founder of Stutern, and will be presenting the work that Stutern does in Nigeria. Kehinde, you have the floor now.
Thank you so much, Chiamaka. I will just share my screen quickly.
Okay.
Perfect. Thanks a lot again for the conversation, and thanks for the invitation to speak over here. It's exciting, talking about the future of work for Africans. I mean, we would talk about what we do as students, and then we'll also do a little bit about the quality of jobs that have been created in that industry, and more also what we've learned so far. One about, we can't publish a report that will be out early next year, so we'll just give you an average version of that, more of what we're learning from the youth, and also some of the key obstacles, but also areas as well for opportunities likewise. So as Stutern, for over the past 8 years, we've been working closely with youth and young Africans, largely based in Nigerians. We see that we have this huge mismatch, like we've all said, between the quality of education, but also in terms of what employers want. It doesn't match up together. So what we do is we kind of pay for this deficit. We see how do we come in, how do we learn from the employers what they're looking for, and how can we equip the young Africans with the soft but also technical skills. So we are focused in the tech industry, and then it talks about software engineers, product designers, product managers, data scientists, for example. So we are able to train young people, and we're able to also place them into jobs globally. These are a few of our alumni on the right-hand side of the page, who we've been very privileged to work with, because they are young Nigerians or Africans who are very driven. We're very selective because, again, when it comes to job placements, it's important we put on the glasses of an employer and say, as an employer, what would I like to hire for? So that's what we do. We have, for example, Chinonso, who is also a lady on the right-hand side on top. She works for a company based in Nigeria, Paystack, as a designer. I mean, she started a course totally unrelated back at University of Lagos, I think microbiology, but she After school, she didn't get a job in that sector. She also didn't even have an interest in getting in that sector. So our job was to work with children who had no idea about the industry, but we had to work with her with a group of mentors and faculty. And over time, she was able to gain skills, and then she got an internship while working with this company, and now she's been retained for the past 2 years with this company. And this is the same across all the talents we work with. Again, we have Silas at the bottom of the screen, who currently has moved to Australia to work for a global company called Canva that we might be familiar with. So these are also the same stories of young people who have gone to university, haven't spent 4 or 5 years. However, when they're done with university, it's hard for them to match up with what employers are actually looking for. So it's really critical for employers to work closely with the industry, to the education industry, like the last speaker just mentioned. It's important to make sure there's this match and this communication alongside. So that's what we typically do. And when it comes to the quality of jobs that are being created, I mean, I would use what we do again as an example. We have other players in the industry. We have the likes of Andela, that might be aware of the Decagon. As Stutern as well, what we've been able to do is typically when someone joins in to come in our program, from our demography data, we realize that most of them, about 94% of them, live on under $3 a day. That's what they live on. And at the end of the program, all of them, 100% of them would to get a job at the end of the day, live above $15 a day. That is 5 times what they previously had. And this is also about 30% more than the industry average. So the digital job provides this huge opportunity, quality of job, decency of job, but also includes a number of things as well. With digital jobs, people are able to, it's more like a global passport. They can work anywhere in the world. And we'll get into all of these quickly as well. Also looking further, I will talk more about youth engagement. What we've seen is the way I define, the way we see youth engagement as Stutern is more of the way Abraham Lincoln explains democracy, which says the government of the people, for the people, and also by the people. I mean, the bias that we need to engage in youth when it comes to creating policies, creating regulations. For example, we have these charts and these age bar in Africa where we have those in leadership very distant in years from those who are actually being led. So that creates a lot of misinterpretation, and that affects the number of innovation that we're seeing. So we want to see more of this closing up. But also we have, like I said earlier, this mismatch between what education institution actually prepares the youth for, but then what also the companies are asking for is also totally very different. I mean, we are out of 2 million people applied to go into universities, for example, in Nigeria yearly, and about 1 in 4, 25% of them get into universities. The other 75%, where do they classify them? They cannot even engage adequately when it comes to digital jobs, or even the Industrial Revolution, for example, or the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So they can't even engage in that. So we need to also have this inclusion when we're talking about all this innovation, digital tech. We need to think about how even the youth, we need to put a name to the youth, not just the number. We need to put a name to the youth. We have youth who are not even, who haven't even acquired a basic education. We have those who have acquired. And getting education doesn't also mean that one would also get jobs. More youth who have tertiary education, they are more likely to be unemployed for a long time compared to those who don't have education. Because when they're done with education, they have high expectation. But when it gets to the employer, it's something entirely different in terms of the pay, the sense of job, the relevance of the cost of study, example. So if we have more youth engagement, it will be exciting. It will be exciting to see all of this put together. We also publish, part of the report we will publish later next year. And the next year is we ask young people, for example, do you work remotely? For example, we are seeing that there's actually a change as well in the nature of work. One is COVID-19 has brought us with these. COVID-19 has brought us with these new way of work where we see more people working remotely or hybrid than people working actually in the office, or for example. So we see that even when we engage more with you, we're able to learn about these changing dynamics and seeing how we can accommodate these changing needs with the realities for the policies and also for the innovations we are introducing. Talking about the obstacles again, government policies, for example, apart from just matching you to jobs, even for young companies who are starting up, if we are looking to train young people to be entrepreneurs, we also need to be sure that there are ways and enabling environment to accommodate for this. We have a number of tech companies who, based on the government regulation, they have changed their quotas, for example, because in the fintech industry, the governments are not really aligned with the changes happening globally. We have companies being forced to relocate entirely because they can't survive. We also have, like Louise and Landry said, cost of connectivity also being a big issue. And when we look at the average income of some of the people that come to our program, at the end of the day, when we surveyed youth, for example, even we realized that 85% of people live below $600 and just about 15% live above that. So this brings to perspective why the cost of connectivity, cost of devices also needs to be put into perspective likewise. And lastly, the opportunities in this sector, in this new phase that we're moving to, the fourth industrial revolution, future of work. One is we have more jobs happening remotely. It's not until a young person migrate from the shores of this continent to a different continent that they can access these jobs. We now have platforms where they can access jobs remotely that pay decently. They're becoming globally competitive as well. We also have young people being able to create more companies. And then also from the report that we're also realizing is we're realizing that there's also this shift as well, where we have a good number of young people who are beginning to earn in foreign currency. And we see that this will continue as a trend in the coming years. Jobs will be destroyed, but also new jobs will be created. But also the current jobs that we currently have or that would actually remain, can the quality of these jobs be improved on? Would we have this issue of jobs? Can we include more women? Can we bring in people who are currently segregated in the industry as well? So those are the learnings we share, and we're excited about this, and we are happy to talk more about this. Again, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Kehinde. Thank you so much, Mirjam. And then we have had a lot of conversations, and there are so many questions to ask and so many things to talk about. And we're almost out of time, but I'll try to make sure that we have as many points covered as we can in the short time that we have. So I'd like to ask, when we throw the questions at you, please try to keep your responses brief, less than a minute, so that we are able to discuss this and cover quite a lot of points. So I would just like to first of all start with Niall, if he's still here. The conversation or the question that was asked about projects, or maybe not projects now, approaches that have been taken to address the increasing digital divide, and approaches to reduce inequalities. I'd like to know if you would like to give any reflections on that. And the second question for Niall, I'd like to know what you think. So there has been an ongoing debate or conversation from the previous webinars where there was a debate about supply versus demand. So is it that we do not have adequate demand, there are no jobs, there isn't anybody absorbing young people? Are countries ready is the future ready for young people? Or is the question, are young people ready for the future? There's we don't have enough jobs, or we have enough jobs, we don't have enough people that are qualified for those jobs. I'd just like to know if you want to weigh in on this, especially when discussing the digital revolution and technology as regards youth employment.
Okay, thank you. Yes, yes, indeed. Well, taking the last point first, yes, clearly there are not enough productive job opportunities, particularly for young people in the African continent. This is clearly the case. What to do about it? Well, this will require, as I suggested, but very briefly, that integrated, coherent job creation strategy, and that can necessarily involve structural transformation. And what that looks like in specific country context will depend on the country context. So it's a bit difficult to be very general about that, but it requires a coherent and coordinated approach to the issue, which includes also issues to do with the digital economy and to do with the fourth industrial revolution. But to be honest, the fourth industrial revolution in the African context is, let's say, not yet that visible, because essentially robotics and these kind of technologies are quite expensive, and labor costs are relatively cheap. So far that this, and of course there's access to the internet and so on, this is somewhat obstacles to implementation of these technologies. But on digital divide, more generally digital inequalities, I think we need to be very careful, but there are approaches that can be adopted. I mean, one's seeing this more. So Hannah talked a lot, and I didn't emphasize the issue because in the African context, the attractions for individuals, for young people in particular, of digital forms of employment can outweigh some of the disadvantages. As I mentioned, however, though wages in crowd work, for example, digital platform work are relatively low. And one does have a number of examples of crowd workers organizing and through digital platform, through social media more generally. And this kind of approach is sometimes supported by workers' organization. And I think some of the examples from higher income countries and upper middle income countries could be usefully taken, because once the technology is there, then one can take advantage of it. One of the emphasis of the ILO in this regard, but this is more general than just the digital economy, is extending social protection coverage and using digital means to extend social protection coverage to a broader range of workers, also in the informal economy, although by definition for the ILO, if access to social protection sort of defines the informal economy. But certainly using these, it's not just about let's say digital platforms and employment, but these technologies can also be used to organize amongst users of platforms, for example, and these types of examples. There are a number of examples. I know mostly emanating from high-income countries, but there's no reason why these kinds of approaches cannot be applied also in lower middle-income countries.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for those responses. So I'd now like to ask another question. I think that I'm not sure who is going to answer this question. I think it's something that Kehinde might be able to answer. But one thing that I just thought about during all the conversations was that we are seeing some particular sectors take up technology and digitalization in Africa specifically a little faster than others. For example, there's an explosion of fintech platforms, there's an explosion of platforms for trade, but some other sectors, this is this question is coming from someone mentioned it in the comments, that some other sectors like the public sector, for example, is much slower. The health sector, for example, is much slower in taking up digitalization and technology as part of those sectors. So what do you think are the specific barriers? Because if we're talking about job creation and not just, getting young people ready for the jobs, but job creation, what are some sectors doing better that is making it easier for them to absorb more young people into these kind of jobs as opposed to other sectors? I don't know if you'd like to share on that.
Oh, definitely. Thanks, Chiamaka. Yeah, I do agree that some sectors we're seeing this quick adaptation where they're able to quickly take on digital innovations. I think fintech for sure. I mean, just over the weekend, I was in a remote place in Nigeria, a very remote place, and I was paying for something, and then this young person who was selling it said, I said, I don't have a cash on me, but he said he has a bank account. I could actually just transfer using my USSD. So it's amazing how quick we've been able to see this adoption in a few industries like the fintech, for example. But when it comes to government or when it comes to industries like the health or agriculture, I think it will take a bit of time. I think one, because with digital jobs also comes some jobs will be eliminated, but also those jobs that actually do remain as well be improved. I think for us to see more of this happening in the government or in health sector or in agriculture, there's a need to educate a few, they need to upskill the skills of the current employees of these industries, of the government, because they wouldn't want, I mean, if I'm in government, if I know that I would lose a job with digital jobs, I wouldn't want to adopt it. But if there's a way for me to understand that actually my job could improve, then I think that's how I'll be able to I'll be receptive to this. I think one is there would need to be an education or upskilling of the people who are currently taking these jobs in these industries, where there's a bit of confidence that their jobs will remain, or at least they will get an improved jobs. But if I feel that I'm going to be eliminated, I will also, as a human being, I will support that in any way. So I think that's why we're not seeing most of these. And also, we're seeing most of these innovations started by young companies. Government can create the environment, but it takes companies and entrepreneurs to actually create those innovations. So innovation comes before regulation. When we see more innovation, we're going to see regulations also coming across the line. So I think across agriculture, health sector, and other industries, we need to upskill the current employees of those companies, like AT&T did back a few years ago when they were looking to move the platform to a different one entirely. They had a lot of probably 10,000 employees, but if they had to go employ new people to take those jobs, that means they would have to prolong the people they've actually employed. But what they've done is create a plan for the next 5 years to see how do we train our employees. They have a domain knowledge. All they need is just for them to update their skills. So I think the same thing also needs to apply to the government, to other industries who are a bit not receptive as much to these innovations. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much.
Just quickly on the question of supply versus demand, I think the evidence is very clear that there the issues on the demand side. And I see that Justin Flynn has joined this webinar. Justin and I did a paper. It's on the Brookings website on that. And I believe we presented it as part of the Include series. It's a problem of demand, and that's where governments really need to focus. I think I would just put that up.
Thank you for that point. And it ties into what Kehinde said, that a lot of the time uptake has to be deliberate. So for some things it will just progressively happen, but in certain sectors it has to be deliberate planning by government and policies to ensure that and these new jobs are created in digital sector to favor this particular sector. So I see that Miriam's hand has been up. So I'll give the floor to her, and then Niall wants to go afterwards. Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to react as well on the demand and the supply side, because I think that there's a lot of efforts to be made to improve the education system still in a lot of countries. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are, I don't have the figures in my head or ready just now, but there are a lot of people that don't have even the basic skills to read and write if they come off secondary education by the age of 17. I mean, how can we expect that they are employable in new sectors, or how do we expect them to be creative, to be employable? Because I think also if you teach young people to be creative, to be problem solving, to have this 21st century skills, then they can create themselves. Or even if they don't have the exact technical skills that is needed for a certain job, they can be creative and find themselves another type of job within a new sector or within a similar sector. So I think that there is a real basis in education systems to improve first, to also to link or to narrow that gap. Mm-hmm. Thank you
so much. Thank you. I think Niall wanted to make another point, digital inclusion.
Yeah, just quickly. I mean, one of the things that came out of our analysis of crowd workers is that women, young women, but also older women earn about 20% less, have about wage rates of about 20% lower than male crowd workers. This is to do with, not to do with discrimination, because there's no indication of gender and no way of distinguishing gender in terms of the job request, but it has to do, it's a supply side phenomenon. But not in itself a positive thing, but it does suggest that for some people, and we're seeing it more and more with COVID and teleworking and so on, some of the flexibility that the digital platform allows, at least allows a potential for let's say, creating more better working conditions or more flexible working conditions, which could suit women with care responsibilities, for example, or more generally, people with disabilities, which makes it difficult for them to go to have face-to-face jobs. And this kind of opportunity could certainly be developed more, thought about more by through the support of government policy, I think. And this is an area that has been underexplored so far. I just wanted to make that point. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Niall, and thank you to all our speakers for contributing. And something that I am getting very strongly out of this conversation, to put everything together, is that this is still a conversation that is evolving. One, there is still a lot to be learned, and there are going to be a lot of priorities depending on what lens you're looking at it through. But it's also important to understand that this is a multi-sector, collaborative effort that will require deliberate, planned policy. So it can't just happen. There's a lot of small scale efforts, especially by young people. I'm proud of my generation. They're taking the creative, innovative, but in order for all of this to be sustainable, it needs to be backed by very strong policies and strong structural support by government and policies. So this is something that I am finding very interesting out of this conversation. So I'd like now to move to Tijmen, who will be wrapping up the conversation today, and he will be reflecting on all the conversations that we've had from the beginning, and talk about considerations on meaningful youth participation. Tijmen is the ambassador for youth education and work at the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I'd like to give him the floor now. Thank you, Tijmen.
Thank you, Chiamaka, and thank everyone for your insights. Considering we're already running late, I will make sure that I will actually not summarize all the debates that have been happening with regards to youth at work for you now. I'll just try to keep it very short. I also want to thank Landry and Louise for the very interesting paper and for a bit of an insight in the crystal ball. And thanks for all the insights the other speakers shared. So I won't summarize everything. I think what we generally do see, if I look at all the different sessions that actually took place over the last couple of weeks or months, actually, digitalization, rural economy, green economy, looking at policies, but also specifically at challenges for youth in conflict and the future of work, of course, now. I understand that all of these were very informative and very interesting. I understand from my colleagues. And of course, they're all very much intertwined. Specifically, if you look at it from a perspective of a young person who, of course, doesn't adhere to this division of different subjects, but actually lives through his or her own life, and actually needs to see us work in an integrated way as well. So look at what we do from a perspective of a young person. Chiamaka also just really alluded to this as well. If we want to have good policy, and I want to start with that, we need to ask young people about their dreams, their aspirations. And if we work specifically in a youthful society, as we very much often do, also in my position as Ambassador for Youth Education and Work, working at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, very much focusing on development cooperation. A lot of these societies, of course, all of them are very young. The demographic reality is a young one. So we need to integrate our the opportunities and young people and their challenges into our work. We need to adapt, so to say. So that is actually our Youth at Heart strategy. at least one part of it. I'll come to the second later. So young people know best what the challenges and opportunities of the are. For example, how to make the rural sector more appealing. They have a more future-oriented outlook, actually, at sustainable growth, more climate conscious. They often know what skills are needed in the 21st century. And actually, they often do voice their willingness to work in the digital sector as well, as we've also heard from the previous speaker. This sector actually provides a lot of opportunities for the future. So we hear that back from young people. So again, it is actually really good to start your conversation by listening to young people. It sharpens your mind. I recently, a week ago, I spoke to a young woman from Egypt, and she said that actually we need to focus all that we do. We need to push businesses to go online, because if they go online, if they are more digital, we actually create a more level playing field for the young people who are a bit more digitally native. I really like that way of thinking. As she was saying, like, if you only invest in digital opportunities, you actually push back against a conservative tendency to not let young people have a level playing field, as is often not the case. I like the idea, and it was another example of how it really, well, for me, it was another reminder of how important it was to talk to young people for the fresh insight. But of course, it's also not that simple, because also a lot of people warn us, and as we heard today as well, that the digital divide is real. So if we're talking about the future of work and the digitalization that's currently happening, I think we also need to listen to that. I noticed, talking to young people, there is often no romantic or naive view on digitalization. And Landry also mentioned this. And yes, our digital age holds much promise for turbocharging our work, to achieve the SDGs. They open new frontiers of productivity and new opportunities for people, particularly for young people, as I just said as well. But it can also reinforce, and we've heard this today, and accelerate inequalities. As the world becomes more digitally dependent, it threatens to exclude those that remain disconnected. So indeed, here, the investment in connectivity is crucial. So this brings us automatically, of course, into the topic of today, the future of work. And as the report said, and we learned as well during the presentation that we saw in the beginning, the services sector represent the greatest opportunity. And youth could actually benefit most, as long as the infrastructure is there. But the report concludes, well, giving the starting place, it says most service sector employment is likely to remain informal in lower middle income countries and low income countries. And Landry actually raised some key challenges as well during this presentation with regards to skills, regulations, infrastructure, financing, which is very important for all of us to be very aware of. So the balance, that's what we learned today as well, between positive and negative outcomes of the fourth industrial revolution will depend on the policy choices countries make. As Louise said, and I really like that, technology is the tool, the outcome actually depends on policy. So summarizing this, the new technology could bring many advantages, also for countries in sub-Saharan Africa, of course. The digital economy has the potential to enhance productivity, income, and social well-being. And it's expected that the jobs that will disappear, that they could be replaced by new jobs, which will mostly center around digital skills, combined with soft skills such as problem solving, more empathic skills. These are things, these 21st century soft skills that was also mentioned today as well. So what we need to do is make sure that the education systems, all of us together, actually respond to the mismatch that exists between the skills being taught and the skills businesses need. And Mirjam also explained a bit about that, and we heard about it during this session. This means, for example, on-the-job training, adapting curricula, and focusing more within universities and TVET within focusing more on soft skills as well. And of course, lifelong learning. So here we actually have let's say the second pillar of our Youth at Heart strategy. So I said it's about making sure that we put the challenges and opportunities and the voice of young people at the heart of what we do. The second pillar is really to bridge that gap between skills and jobs. And we indeed need to do that together with the private sector. So we invest as the Netherlands in quality education and better work income for young people, specifically addressing the gender gap, and really focusing, as I said, between the skills gap that exists. So we got a few programs for that. I will not go into that now, into promotion for our programs because we're running late. So, but I would generally say it's about, this approach will only work if we focus also on digital skills and jobs, because that is in the end very, very often, as we heard today as well, really crucial, looking at the future, but also looking at the present, looking at the skills that are needed. And as I said, we need to invest while doing this actually in the voice of young people. We need to invest in meaningful youth participation. So that's why we organized the Youth at Heart Virtual Forum. That's why we organized, we actually just launched last week, Youth Advisory Committee to really talk about these type of subjects with young people, not just about young people. And already they immediately said, these young people from Africa and the Middle East, actually, they immediately indicated that they want to talk about entrepreneurship and digital literacy. So it's very clear that they are also, of course, looking at issues that we discussed today. So we need a common effort, collaboration amongst government. We heard that today as well, with the private sector, civil society, academia, multilateral organizations, and of course, young people. We got so much to learn from the generation that will be most affected. And it's up to us, let's say policymakers, to really listen to their voice and really adapt our work and make sure that actually young people will be able to get the skills to get them into the 21st century. So that is actually what I want to say. There's more I want to say, but I'm quite conscious of the time. So thank you so much for your attention. And once again, thanks to Include for organizing this wonderful session. I learned a lot today.
Thank you so much, Tijmen. It's always good listening to you and your reflections and the work that you do with Youth at Heart. And congratulations on the Youth Advisory Panel. I think it is very important and a good example of how to make sure that young people are part of the process from the very beginning. So we have come to the end of today's conversation. I have had a swell time. I see that it seems like there is a lot to talk about, but I have a feeling that even if we're giving 5 hours, we wouldn't finish. But this has been a very interesting conversation, and this has been an interesting series of webinars. I think now we can keep the conversation going. Include has all the posts up on LinkedIn, Twitter, and then after each webinar, a news article is done. So this is something that is ongoing and that we can keep talking about. Thank you to all our speakers for your insightful and very timely interventions and discussions. I think that you have contributed quite a lot to the existing knowledge, and we continue to learn every day. And then to the Include team, Maya, Giovanni, Siri, you have been superstars from the very beginning. You have done so much. I mean, Maya wasn't feeling very well at some point, but she has done so much work. And I'm really grateful to you all for inviting me here. I have learned so much. So thank you to everyone once again. I do hope that you have a very wonderful day and a very good evening. Bye.